Right now, Crimea is in flames. These strikes by the AFU have finished off the Russians. Ukraine has done the incredible in liberating the peninsula. The Russian air defense was breached and a fiery hail descended upon the enemy. The entire sky and area are under attack. The fire is visible from space. Russians are in hysteria. Chaos has engulfed the country. A sensation. The Pentagon has urgently convened hundreds of generals. A lightning-fast response for Moscow. This will destroy Russia. Incredible reinforcements for the Ukrainian armed forces. Tens of thousands of allied troops are heading to Ukraine. Putin is beside himself. The coalition against the Russian Federation is growing by the hour. A turning point. Trump has made a fateful decision regarding Ukraine. A shocking US turnaround. Even Zelensky didn't expect this. Europe is on the verge of an explosion. Poland with nuclear weapons. NATO is preparing a devastating strike on Moscow. The US and Turkey are joining forces against the Kremlin. The collapse of the world's second army. There are no tanks left. Soldiers are fleeing on foot to their deaths. The Ukrainian armed forces are burning the last of the equipment. The Kremlin is in a panic. The apocalypse is already here. All this and more in our Hotspot segment. Urgent. Ukraine is taking back Crimea. A missile strike changes the entire game. The peninsula is turning into a real Chornobivka for Russia. The occupiers are in a panic. Strike after strike. Russian air defense is powerless. The Ukrainian armed forces deliver deadly blows every time. The Russians have been driven off the peninsula. This is the beginning of the end for the Russian world. All the details in our report.
The Russians are clearly having problems in Crimea. And the further it goes, the more surprises await the enemy.
Crimea is gradually, if we draw analogies, thanks to the Ukrainian defense forces, it has turned into a kind of Krimobivka. By analogy with Chornobivka, where the Russian army and Russian occupiers, along with their weapons and equipment, are constantly being destroyed.
Ukrainian defenders know exactly where the Russian occupiers are located in occupied Crimea and are doing everything possible to drive them out.
There is active work being done in Crimea. The process of demilitarizing Crimea continues. This is an integral part of the deoccupation process.
During the occupation, Crimea is facing more and more problems with fuel, water, and military equipment. Ukrainian strikes are destroying enemy bases while the Russians are trying to hide the scale of their losses. We are talking about ground, air, and naval operations that our defenders are successfully carrying out.
Look.
Today, the Russian military facilities in Crimea that were hit are those that pose a threat not only to the peninsula itself because they are located there, but also in fact threaten other territories of our country. This is equipment. Today, it is currently being actively used to launch devastating missile strikes directly on our sovereign territory, causing significant damage. Accordingly, this is what allows the Russians to conduct extensive reconnaissance of our airspace.
There is a regular elimination of enemy air defense facilities, destruction of naval targets, and strikes on ground targets, including railways.
The air defense system in Crimea, which is currently operating very actively and trying to repel strikes by Ukrainian defense forces, something they are not very successful at, is also being used as a weapon of killing.
Problems with supplies are growing on the peninsula, and the Russians' defensive positions are collapsing.
Work is also underway on those key points that will open the door to Crimea, in particular the Kinburn Spit, the Androvska Spit, and of course the territory of Crimea itself.
Almost every week, the destruction of Russian helicopters or air defense elements is recorded. This creates an atmosphere of fear among the occupiers and forces them to conserve resources. Ukrainian drones even reached the government dakas on the night of September 22nd. Explosions thundered in the Foros area. Russian collaborators reported that drones struck the territory of the Foros sanatorium. It was reported that 3 people were killed and 16 were wounded.
It is quite likely that this guest house was actually the meeting place for high-ranking officials, possibly from the FSB or possibly from the armed forces of the Russian Federation. We have not seen any objective monitoring, so-called, from the Russian side, with evidence of killed or wounded civilians. And that would have been the first thing the Russian Federation would have done if that had actually happened.
The Russians kept silent about the fact that at the time of the attack there were very important guests in the sanatorium. Exactly who they were is not specified. A notice was posted on the sanatorium's social media page stating that on September 21st, the Foros Hall restaurant would be closed for special service. All the news reports are showing the school nearby. Most of all,
the school's assembly hall was damaged. Here, part of the ceiling has collapsed. Just look at what's left of one of the walls. From the damage, it's clear that the drone entered through this window. Now debris is scattered everywhere here.
The Russians tried to use this school for their information campaign, even though it was closed on the weekend and there were no students there, attempting to cover up their latest terrorist strikes on our country with propaganda. This is what the Russians always do. But again, it's not about hitting the school itself, it's about the subsequent strike on the Palace of Culture named after Terletsky, which is located across from the school.
Nearby is also the government dacha number 11, the Zarya facility. There's a helicopter pad here, so the FSO is always present and can be called in to secure meetings. We
are demonstrating that today our formidable defense forces, utilizing various powerful means of firepower, can effectively reach the occupiers anywhere within our cherished Crimea, be it in the north, the south, the west, or the east. And today, there is not a single facility in Crimea that cannot be struck by our defense forces. Once again, Russian air defense has proven its ineffectiveness. They are unable to protect either Russia or the temporarily occupied territories. The air defense system in Crimea is being destroyed, and this is the path to the demilitarization of Crimea and, most importantly, its de-occupation. We are on the right track.
The Russian aircraft fleet on the occupied peninsula has been reduced as a result of the successful combat operations by the Ukrainian GUR Special Unit Pryzrak. 3 enemy multi-purpose Mi-8 helicopters were hit, as well as an expensive Russian Nebo-U radar station.
4 helicopters have been destroyed in just a few days. 2 unique B-12 Chaika aircraft have been destroyed. There are actually very few of them in the Black Sea Fleet. If I'm not mistaken, there are 6, and 2 have already been destroyed.
The scout showed footage of the operation and drone video of one of the destroyed helicopters. Occupied Crimea has become a symbol of the fuel collapse. It was here that large amounts of fuel were brought in to refuel Russian military equipment. As a result, there are now shortages and record high fuel prices on the peninsula. The rise in gasoline prices is linked to Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil refineries. The video shows Sevastopol. In Yalta, gasoline was delivered to one of the gas stations. The line of people wanting to refuel is simply enormous. Neither the Russian authorities nor the occupying authorities in Crimea acknowledge the problem. They insist that it's merely a matter of logistics. Instances of human rights violations in Crimea are regularly documented and submitted to the UN Human Rights Council and the OSCE. The Russian occupation administration is forcibly conscripting Crimeans into the ranks of the Russian armed forces. Refusal to serve is punishable by criminal prosecution. In addition, there is ongoing militarization of children. Crimea is waiting to return, and Ukraine is not allowing Russia to normalize the occupation.
Urgently, the AFU are destroying Russia from the sky, Ukraine's triumph. A gasoline apocalypse has engulfed the entire country, Kupiansk reduced to dust. Russian troops are losing control, and the AFU are preparing a devastating strike. This is the turning point of the war. Putin has attacked a NATO country. Europe is on the brink of chaos. World War III is approaching. The Pentagon is urgently gathering hundreds of generals. The footage is terrifying. All the details are in the report.
It seems yet another oil refinery is burning in Russia, this time the Afipsky oil refinery located in the Krasnodar region of Russia. According to Russian media, the plant was attacked on the night of September 26th. And not just by anyone, but by unidentified drones. And the situation with gasoline in Russia will only get worse, since the Afipsky refinery specializes in producing gasoline and diesel fuel.
Yeah, that's right. By about 15 rubles at once. This happened over the course of about 4 shifts.
And how are people reacting?
Well, how am I supposed to react? Meanwhile,
the Institute for the Study of War reports that despite increased Russian activity in the Kupiansk area, the Russian army does not control any districts of the city.
This is the so-called gray zone, which has existed for several months now. That is, neither the Ukrainian defense forces nor the Russian occupiers control this territory.
The activity in Kupiansk is also explained by the main objective of the Russians in this area, but
The main goal of the Russian occupiers is not Kupiansk itself, but Kupiansk-Vuzlovi. This is an attempt to establish control over the main logistics hub of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, the largest railway station, control over which would allow the Russians, by taking advantage of a short logistics route, to transfer operational reserves both from the territory of the Russian Federation and from the occupied areas of Luhansk region, in order to form a strike group that would subsequently advance along the Oskil River.
more broadly speaking, the situation is similar in other directions. In the Sumy and Kursk areas, Russian attacks remain unsuccessful, and near Lyman there have been no breakthroughs. On the Pokrovsk direction, the attacks are more active, but there is still no confirmed success. The same situation is observed in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. But it is known that Russia is redeploying part of its naval infantry from the Sumy and Kherson regions to fight in Donetsk. But it turns out this is the work of the Ukrainian military.
At the moment, the Ukrainian Defense Forces are carrying out a number of actions aimed at creating an operational encirclement of the Russian occupation troops. It is no coincidence that the Ukrainian Defense Forces struck in the area of the settlement of Pankivka. This is essentially the basis for the penetration of Russian troops into Ukrainian defenses. The goal is to cut off Russian units and accordingly to organize the so-called cauldron.
The redeployment of Russian troops is also due to a shortage of forces, since the Russian army cannot conduct active combat and defend itself in several directions at once.
Therefore, in order to prevent such a scenario, the most combat-ready units are being redeployed from the Kursk-Sumy direction to Pokrovsk.
Another hybrid attack on Europe. In Denmark, there was another attack by unidentified drones, which led to the temporary closure of the airspace over the airport. The origin of the drones is also unknown.
It is precisely on the territory of Denmark that a plant for the production of solid fuel for Ukrainian ballistic missiles will be established. Specifically, flaming is a preliminary agreement between the Ukrainian and Danish sides. Therefore, the appearance of so-called unidentified drones is a signal to the Russian Federation that this facility will be regarded as a legitimate target. And it is no coincidence that the appearance of drones is not limited to Denmark and Norway, and accordingly, there was sabotage at the drone manufacturing facility in the United Kingdom.
But Europe's problem is different. They cannot shoot down cheap Russian drones with extremely expensive missiles, as this is unacceptable, Rutte stated.
That is why our supreme allied commander in Europe, together with his colleague working on transformation, and all of us in NATO, are rapidly developing technologies, learning from the Ukrainians, and will begin to implement these new technologies in the coming weeks and months, so that, alongside more traditional ways of addressing these issues, we will also have drone interception technology at our disposal.
But at the Pentagon, they are fully prepared. Pete Hegseth has summoned 100 generals and admirals to an emergency meeting, which is set to take place next week. But most interestingly, the reason for this gathering has not been disclosed.
Trump made an explosive announcement, a complete turnaround. The United States is supporting Ukraine like never before. Zelensky was stunned by these words. The Kremlin is in a panic. This was the last straw. Moscow is already shaking from real strikes. Trump is ready to unleash tough measures. What to expect next? Watch and see.
Did Donald Trump back down, or is he skillfully distancing himself from his promise to end the Russia-Ukraine war? What lies behind the words of the 47th President of the United States? Not so long ago, the whole world was discussing the most scandalous meeting in the Oval Office with the infamous "Where is the suit?" And now, after another round of talks, the White House publishes this photo with the caption, "He is a brave man and he is fighting a hellish battle." And it doesn't stop there. Donald Trump, who until recently insisted that Ukraine had no chance of defeating the great and mighty Russia and that it was time to give up territory, posted this message on his social media. In it, Trump stated for the first time, Ukrainians can not only fight, but also win, while Russia is aimlessly stuck where it planned to sort things out in a week.
In fact, this makes it look like a paper tiger. When people living in Moscow and in all the big cities, villages, and districts across Russia find out what's really happening with this war. The fact that they can't get gasoline because of long lines and all the other things happening in their war economy, where most of their money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which has great spirit that only keeps getting stronger. Ukraine can not only restore its country to its original state, and who knows, maybe even go further. This
is the most pro-Ukrainian statement made by Donald Trump since his return to the campaign office. This rhetoric was immediately praised by Emmanuel Macron and the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. But according to political analysts, Trump's position is dictated by a simple coincidence of factors. On the one hand, Europe has been asserting its independence more and more loudly lately. On the other hand, Ukraine's drone sanctions against Russian oil refineries are bringing Donald's dream closer to sever Europe from the Russian oil pipeline. And the cherry on top is the domestic political situation in the United States. It is precisely because of this that Trump has started calling Putin an aggressor and hinting at sanctions.
He needs to respond to the situation. After all, he is a political animal in the classic political sense. That is, a politician who senses the mood, who always acts based on the context, on what is advantageous at the moment and what is not, on what is the right or wrong move for him, not based on any deep ideological, value-based or other convictions. That's not about him. That's why now we see what seems to be a reversal of position, although in reality it's an evolution. I'll even say, albeit tentatively and with some reservation, giving a certain benefit of the doubt, but based on the events of recent weeks, I can assume that the darkest night with Trump is already behind us. This 8-month period when Trump could still flirt with Putin is coming to an end. And now we are entering a phase where Trump will no longer be a lever in Putin's hands to put pressure on Ukraine and Europe. And it's not a given that he will become a lever in the hands of Ukraine and Europe to put pressure on Putin. And it's not a given that Trump himself will want to put pressure on Putin. There's no need to be under any illusions here, but I think the moment when Trump was part of the problem has already passed. But for now, Trump is not part of the solution either.
Donald didn't manage to charm the Western press either. Journalists recalled that, in fact, all the initiatives that were loudly discussed across the ocean remained unfulfilled. The introduction of sanctions, as well as 500% customs duties and designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, all remain just empty talk.
Trump made it clear that he is ready to take radical steps only after America's allies make their contributions first. In fact, that's exactly what he said. There were no hints of additional aid or that the US plans to punish Moscow more seriously, because those legislative initiatives we keep mentioning remain just that, initiatives. They are not being voted on. Trump is categorically opposed to having his Congress vote for the imposition of sanctions. He says, I will make the decision against Putin myself, and he will spend another month thinking about whether he trusts Putin or not. He literally said this just yesterday.
Some analysts believe that Donald's statement is not an epiphany, but an attempt to wash his hands of such an important issue as stopping the war. The 47th US president has actually managed to profit from the war. Irrevocable aid has been halted, and weapons are being supplied to Ukraine with European money. The final word in the debate, whether he has had an awakening or is skillfully distancing himself, will be determined by the next steps taken by the White House administration. So far, the US has not even joined the statement by 36 countries at the UN General Assembly, which calls on Russia to stop the killing and begin substantive negotiations.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
The Ukrainian armed forces are receiving incredible reinforcements. Tens of thousands of soldiers will arrive in Ukraine. The Kremlin is in a panic and Putin is beside himself. Countries are no longer afraid of Russia. The coalition against Moscow is growing before our eyes. Who has become Ukraine's unexpected ally? These details have blown up the internet. Watch all the shocking details right now.
Even more help and support. The Ukrainian armed forces may receive reinforcements to fight against the Russian occupiers. The president of Indonesia stated that he is ready to send peacekeepers to Ukraine under the auspices of the United Nations once the appropriate decision is made by the UN.
We will continue to serve wherever defenders are needed for peace, not just with words but with boots on the ground. If and when the UN Security Council and the General Assembly decide, Indonesia is ready to send 20,000 or even more of our sons and daughters to establish peace in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan, in Libya, and everywhere else where peace needs to be ensured.
Accordingly, the 20,000-strong contingent that Indonesia is ready to send is not enough to monitor the situation along the entire length of the Russian-Ukrainian front. At present, the Russian-Ukrainian front stretches for more than 1,200 kilometers. Therefore, there is no reason to speak about the effectiveness of a peacekeeping mission, specifically a contingent of up to 20,000 personnel. This would be nothing more than a monitoring mission.
Earlier, the president of the UN General Assembly, Annalena Baerbock, stated that she does not rule out the possibility of deploying UN peacekeeping forces in Ukraine to support the ceasefire and post-war recovery, if the majority of member states agree to this.
According to Dagi Dainat, organizing a peacekeeping mission requires going through several stages. The first stage is the familiarization stage, when a UN representative travels to the country and becomes acquainted with the military, economic, political, and religious aspects in the territory where a peacekeeping mission might be deployed. But most importantly, according to Dagi Dainat, deploying a peacekeeping mission requires the consent of both sides of the conflict. That is not only Ukraine, but also the Russian Federation. This is essentially a stumbling block. It's a dead end for the peacekeepers' mandate because under Dagi Dainat, the budget must be approved. Again, the Russian Federation is one of the main sponsors of the United Nations, so to say that they would be interested in financing a peacekeeping operation at the expense of the Russian Federation's budget is not realistic. It does not align with their actions.
Let us recall that on September 4th in Paris, a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing was held with the participation of President Zelensky, where possible future security guarantees for Ukraine were discussed, aimed at ensuring a just and lasting peace. 26 countries have officially agreed to form support forces, which are to be deployed in Ukraine immediately after a ceasefire is established. As part of this plan, 2 separate ground groups will be created.
Military personnel from these countries, if present on Ukrainian territory, will be regarded by the Russian Federation as participants in hostilities on the side of Ukraine. Accordingly, the Russian Federation will claim the legitimacy of military targets at the moment of the physical elimination of these servicemen.
Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already threatened that any European military contingents in Ukraine will become legitimate targets for Putin's army. He noted that their presence in Ukraine will be regarded by Russia as the occupation of the country by the West. He also added that the Russian Federation will not pay attention to the peacekeepers' flag.
The Russian Federation is categorically against the deployment of any foreign military contingent on the territory of Ukraine. This is essentially a cornerstone, a Rubicon, which they cannot cross. Accordingly, these discussions about the possible deployment of a peacekeeping contingent are merely a political component. This is a statement not backed by concrete actions. Everything depends on the position of the Russian Federation.
But all of this is just a possibility for the future. Whether Western partners will actually send peacekeeping troops remains an open question.
It happened. Poland is bringing out Europe's nuclear arsenal on the eve of the apocalypse. A real war is starting. Lavrov made an unexpected statement. You'll be shocked when you hear it. And Trump hit Putin hard. Erdogan is wavering. The US and Turkey are uniting against Russia. All the details are coming up.
US President Trump made a new shocking statement. Russia's economy is going to hell, while Ukraine is doing a great job stopping the huge Russian army.
Things are going very badly for them, considering they've put everything on the line. Their economy is going to hell. They're bombing everything indiscriminately, yet capturing very little territory, if any at all. In fact, they're even losing some of their own territory. So I think this has really damaged Russia's reputation.
Also, during a meeting with Turkish President Erdogan, Trump stated that he is ready to lift sanctions on Turkey and consider the possibility of selling F-35 fighter jets, provided that Turkey stops purchasing Russian oil and gas.
I would like him to stop buying oil from Russia while Russia continues its atrocities against Ukraine. I think he could have a greater impact if he wanted to. But he likes to remain neutral, though he could intervene and stop buying oil and gas from Russia. That would be the best solution.
The head of EU diplomacy, Callas, has literally demanded more initiative from the American president. She stated that Europe cannot end the war in Ukraine on its own. The United States and NATO must share the responsibility.
We have put pressure on Russia, we have helped Ukraine, but we must do more because the aggression is still ongoing, and we are also counting on cooperation with our allies, including the United States, on this issue.
European leaders, it seems, are afraid and are trying to protect themselves from Putin by all possible means. Polish President Nawrocki stated that his country is not opposed to possessing nuclear weapons. For
the safety of Poles, possessing nuclear weapons and joining the nuclear sharing program would be the right and responsible decision. It is my duty to do everything that will ensure Poland's security. And I emphasize that our wars, which we have fought over the centuries, have always been defensive.
And it's not surprising since Russia has once again declared that they are at war with NATO. Foreign Minister Lavrov claimed that in fact it is NATO and the European Union who have declared war on Russia.
Another clear example is the crisis in Ukraine provoked by the West, through which NATO and the European Union want to declare, have already declared a real war on my country and are directly participating in it.
The Russians are trying to squeeze themselves into the international agenda by any means possible. Putin received the Director General of the IAEA, Grossi, at the Kremlin. Grossi thanked Putin for his support and invited the Russians to a conference in Austria.
I invite all of you to Vienna in December, where we will hold the first international conference on nuclear energy and artificial intelligence. We are bringing in all the companies from Russia, the West, and Asia that are part of this alliance, which is about to come to fruition. And we need to see how it will work.
You can play at being a great power without which no important decisions in the world are made as much as you like. But Russia continues to be a terrorist and an aggressor which all civilized countries must fight against.
Exclusive apocalypse in the Russian army. Russian soldiers are being sent to the front on foot. There are no tanks at all. Tank crews are in a panic, left with the choice to either surrender or flee, while the ISU destroys the remaining armored vehicles, and the Kremlin, in a rage, is hiding the scale of the disaster. Russia has been left without tanks. The so-called Second Army of the world is finished. Why this changes the entire course of the war, watch right now.
Russian tanks are on the verge of extinction. It seems the Russian military-industrial complex can't keep up and will soon be left with nothing at all. And apparently sanctions are to blame for this. The role
of sanctions here is more about the fact that these are streams, these are integrations, a worsening, where the strength and quality of the gap in which Russia is aligning itself is quite significantly weakening it in advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, where Russia could have failed.
It seems that Putin's claims about Russia's resilient economy are starting to show a noticeable crack.
Sooner or later, the overheating of the military economy may not lead to its collapse, but to a sharp downturn. The general economic trends in the Russian Federation will also affect the military sectors of the economy.
It would seem that for the first time since 2022, salaries have started to fall at Russia's most important enterprises. And yes, we're talking about companies in the military-industrial complex.
Undoubtedly, lending to enterprises in the military-industrial complex has an impact. And the difference in the form and volume of this lending compared to the non-military sector. This used to be an advantage, but now it's working against them. Having essentially reached its peak, it's now either stagnation or decline.
But how then do staffing shortages and economic problems affect the expansion of Russia's military-industrial complex?
The Russian economy's ability to supply the army, to provide military equipment and ammunition, these abilities are not limitless either. Moreover, even with rapid expansion, the modern Russian economy can only reach Soviet-era levels.
Of course, sanctions are no joke, especially when they worsen the condition and quality of your military equipment or may even halt new production altogether. But that's when Soviet-era tanks come to the rescue.
The focus shifted to restoring Soviet equipment. Old Soviet equipment from storage, refurbishing ammunition, and again, reworking and preparing it for combat. These resources are not limitless either.
But now the time has come when old equipment doesn't make the job easier, but rather complicates it.
There are fewer and fewer units that can actually be repaired. We have to fix things that aren't really repairable, to take apart and reassemble from several units, and that requires much more effort, work, and so on.
As a result, instead of producing new and modern equipment, Russia is increasingly using old and worn-out machinery.
The production of new equipment is hindered, yes, by sanctions among other things, and also by the unpreparedness of the manufacturing base. That's why the pace of ramping up production of modern types of weaponry is nowhere near what Russia needs to make up for losses on the battlefield. So, they prefer to fund what will deliver results here and now, rather than tomorrow or the day after.
Let's not forget about Putin's loyal friends, China and Iran, who are actually helping them a great deal.
We have always been together, so we remain together now as well.
But any delivery is more a way for Beijing to keep Moscow on a short leash. In fact,
it's China that's helping the Russians pull up their technological base. However, at the very same time, the Chinese are actively helping Moscow precisely from the powerful position of a suzerain. Consequently, they meticulously keep their firm hand on the metaphorical tap, implying that if Moscow consistently acts in a proper and agreeable manner, they might indeed open it up and provide further assistance.
But in the end, what do we have as of today? It is known that in 2024, Russia's military industry has reached the limits of its capabilities. But what are Russia's prospects now?
There may very well be a significant plateau, as we commonly call it. That is to say, when the absolute maximum indicators have been thoroughly reached, further substantial growth is indeed impossible. But it is certainly possible to effectively prevent a decline through careful administrative measures.
The only question is, how long will the Kremlin be able to maintain this level, and could it turn out that an unexpected blow comes not from the front, but from within?
Corruption in Russia, that's our crucial ally. The more the powerful generals and the influential icebreakers of the Russian economy, specifically the vast military-industrial complex, continue their rampant stealing and illicit activities, the less genuine chance they ultimately have of successfully staying on this elevated plateau of power and influence. But for now, it is evident that they are indeed stealing quite a substantial amount, and their insatiable appetites for more wealth and control appear to grow exponentially with each passing year, further exacerbating the systemic issues within the nation.
But of course, sanctions are only a small part of what can help Ukraine defend itself against the Russian Federation. Nevertheless, an important factor is also the increase in Ukrainian military weapons production.
You can't just believe that sanctions will solve everything, that it all depends on them, or that what we're doing here, responding blow for blow, is enough. You could say that sanctions are just an alternative to weapons, but not a substitute for them, essentially, in terms of both quality and timing.
That's all for now. For more updates straight from the front lines, tune in to our next episode. See you in the next episode.